talk about people who have made transformative change from whom we can learn. Reid, Hoffman, and Peter Thiel are probably as good examples as you could come up with, regardless of where you looked. As I mentioned before, we were really pleased to give you all Peter's book. The things that Peter's done, and please, Peter and Reid, join me on stage while I continue. I was going slowly because I didn't know how long it would take to bring all of the chairs on stage. But great to see you. Thank you for coming. Peter co-founded PayPal and Palantir, provided early funding for Facebook, thanks to Reid, of course. LinkedIn and Yelp, LinkedIn being Reid's company. But I wanted to just tell you one of the things that I took away from Peter's book, which I really thought was the summary sentence, really like in the third to last paragraph or somewhere near the end. He said, "We cannot take for granted that the future will be better, and that means we need to work to create it today." So that's why Peter's here. Reid is somebody who I've known for a long time. He was a huge help to me when I wrote my book about Facebook. Peter, I also interviewed for that book. They were both very helpful, but Reid just was a real rock on that project. And of course, founded LinkedIn. But these guys went to college together. Most people probably don't know that, but maybe you do, at Stanford. And then they've subsequently partnered in a variety of ways in the technology industry, and I've just mentioned some of the things they've accomplished. But so I really want to find out where they agree and where they disagree, and also, given that I don't know how much of the back and forth you guys just heard before, but there were a lot of serious worries just expressed about where society's heading, the nature of media, the nature of our common life, I think. And I'd just be curious if either of you have, well, first of all, I forgot. I was going to ask you each to do your 90 seconds. Mm-hmm. So since you're nodding, why don't you go first?
Sure. So the question is opportunity and threat. And so both of them, essentially the intersection of biology and computing. You may call it biohacking. The opportunity set is obviously massive transformation in medicine, being able to cure cancer, being able to there may be pluses and minuses on longevity. That's probably Peter thinks there's only pluses. On the minuses side, viruses, incompetent action something that could spread, or kind of bioterrorism is obviously, in some senses, much more frightening than essentially nuclear terrorism. 12 Monkeys as a film as an example. And so I think that the thing that's been most on my mind is I think that sort of technological progress towards the intersection of bio and computing is inevitable. So what do we do to maximize the positive outcomes and minimize the negative ones?
Fascinating. Glad we have our Techonomy Bio Conference. Yeah. Peter.
Well, I'd actually sort of generalize Reid's point to say that I think it's really this question of technology generally that I think we could be seeing decades of phenomenal progress in all sorts of different dimensions. I think there's some worries about it. I'm much more worried about the sort of cultural and political reaction against it. And I think if I had to sort of give frame it slightly negatively, I think we live in a society in which all the culture, all the politics hates science and technology in all forms. The easy way to see this is you just look at all the science fiction movies. They always show technology that kills people, destroys things, doesn't work, is dystopian. The future is going to be a combination of Terminator, Matrix, Avatar, Elysium. I watched the Gravity movie the other day. You would never want to go into outer space. You would just want to be back on a muddy tropical island somewhere. And I think it's not, not blaming Hollywood. I think it simply reflects the broader culture. And so Silicon Valley and what it represents is radically countercultural. It's very much at odds with what people in the Western world actually think about the future or what they want. And so I think we have this sort of, it's like a Zeno's paradox type situation where you have, on the one hand, accelerating technological change, or at least the potential for that, and then a culture and a political system that's incredibly reactionary and incredibly hostile to it.
Actually, so a nuance. So
Oh, if I don't have to do anything, that's
Yeah.
great.
So optimism and fear, I think keeping the optimism is something we agree on. I think the fear is maybe not necessarily, it may be reinforced by culture, but I don't think is inherently cultural. I think that one of the things we find as a biological species, we have a much more intense trigger to change being negative, because the fear of death is more important than the kind of the improvements. And then that compounds into, oh, that's new, that's fearful. And so the question is overcoming their fear for the optimism. So I think I agree in the broad brush, but on the question of, is it just like, oh, we have a broken culture, and the culture, you could wave your wand and the culture would then be all optimists and no fear. I think it's that fear of death and fear of change that kind of underlies it, which that's hard to change.
Well, I don't have any simple solutions to how you change the politics or the culture, but I think that is the sort of incredibly tense dynamic that is at work.
So Peter, if you are so worried about this sort of negativity toward technology, is that like one of the primary motivations for publishing this book? Because it really is an exhortation to innovate. I mean, there's no question it's a celebration of innovation and an exhortation to try harder, to do bigger things.
Well, certainly, I think one of the ways that my best answer for how to change the culture is for people just to actually succeed in doing things that are good for the world and to make it better. And so that's sort of, I think it's too hard to start a mass movement that convinces the whole society to change. I think you can convince small numbers of people to start new companies and do new things. And I think that's how you gradually change the discourse in one way or another.
I want to ask him one more thing about the book, and then I want to hear what you think about this. You know, one of the things that is a massive part of the book is this idea of monopoly and competition, and you're really pro the one that's normally, people are down on monopoly, and very negative about something that most people accept is just a really positive thing, competition. Why did you focus so strongly on that? And what was it that you were thinking that entrepreneurs, which is clearly one of your primary intended audiences, why did they need to hear that message?
Well, I think this idea that you have two kinds of companies. You have companies that are monopolies, and you have companies that compete. I think this is the most important idea in business that people don't talk about, and they don't talk about it because the people who have monopolies lie about that, and the people who are in crazy competition also distort that fact and pretend that they have better businesses than they actually do. And so I think it's a very poorly understood fact, and I do think that we can debate at what point monopolies are good or bad for society, but I think from the inside, if you're starting a business, if you're a founder or entrepreneur, you always want to have a monopoly. You want to be doing something that's so different, that's so much better than the rest of the world, that there's actually no competition at all. And if you want to compete like crazy, you should open a restaurant in San Francisco.
You're really down on opening restaurants. That's also clear from the book.
Well, which I'm never going to do again.
Yes.
Wait, what was that?
He's opened a restaurant.
You are opening a restaurant?
No, past tense.
Oh, you did? Oh, sorry.
Important distinction.
So, do you buy this thinking about monopoly? I mean, what's your reaction?
So let's see. First, 100% agreement on the function is that most people in the entrepreneurial and venture business to scale are essentially trying to build something that is like a monopoly, although exactly how you define a monopoly is one of the interesting characteristics here. The way that they try to define it is such things, they say, well, unfair competitive advantages or network effects or other kinds of things which are attributes, because as Peter points out very accurately, the folks who think that they might be a monopoly or like a monopoly describe themselves as small fish in large ponds, and there's so much competition, and nothing to see here, move along. These are not the monopolies you're looking for. And then the people who actually have a lot of competition, we dominate, and I forget the examples, but it's like rap music, Southern bakery, whatever combination. I forget the examples you use in the book. But we dominate this niche, which actually, in fact, means we actually have lots of competition. So that's all.
The only British Nepalese fusion cuisine in Half Moon Bay.
Yes, exactly. Right. So that is, I think, 100% correct. The thing that I think is where there's interesting room for discussion, where Peter and I might have some divergence in views, is one is the question is, okay, so is a monopoly simply defined by high profits or not? And is a monopoly inherently a good thing or not? Now, I think one of the things that Peter points out very well is to say, well, in order to get investment in the future, you actually have to have a combination of an incentive for investors and an incentive for a company for pouring the money back into creating something. So if you don't have some ability, and especially in a monopolistic context, to generate real profits and to really cause that investment, both from investors and internally, that's a very difficult thing to be mammothly investing in the future. And so the knee-jerk, oh, profits are bad, monopolies are bad, is idiotic, and as I think justly attacked. On the other hand, the question is almost a definition between what you might think of as a ephemeral or fragile monopoly and actually a monopoly that actually doesn't have to work, right? Because a ephemeral or fragile monopoly, many tech things that are described monopolies, are actually in fact working really hard because they're worried that if they don't, 5 years from now, they will no longer have their...
Only the paranoid survive.
Yes. And that actually creates a very good cycle of innovation and in reinvestment. But if they can essentially sit on their laurels, not do anything, collect a massive tax, that creates less innovation. So the question is where
there's obviously lines between good and bad monopolies.
Yeah.
The common sense intuition I have is they become bad when it's totally static. It's good as long as it's dynamic. Then you of course have the question: at what point does that shift? But yeah, if you're like a troll collecting a toll at a bridge, maybe Comcast, something like that, that might be sort of in the bad monopoly category. And then you can sort of debate about some of the larger tech companies over recent decades, whether they were bad or are they going to fall apart on their own anyway? So were they not quite ephemeral, but not perhaps permanent? There's something between ephemeral and permanent. So there's a big spectrum here. But I would say one of the things that this monopoly perspective led me to that's very interesting is that when we think about the history of innovation more broadly over the last 200, 250 years, it is a sobering fact how many of the inventors, creators of new things, how little they actually captured so much of the time. And because to succeed as an inventor, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, two things have to be true. You have to create X dollars of value for the world, and you have to capture Y% of X. And in most cases, Y equals 0. So the Wright brothers didn't make any money, nor did anybody else in the aviation industry for the next 100 years to first approximation. Cumulative profits about 0. If you look at the first industrial revolution, late 18th, early 19th century, where the efficiency of factories was increased by 7 to 10% a year relentlessly for decades, and all of Britain was transformed from 1780 to 1850. 1850, most of the wealth in Britain was still held by the landed aristocracy. The factory owners did not make much money. It was all competed away. And if we look at the last decade in Silicon Valley, there is this very striking contrast between the software businesses and the clean tech businesses, where you could certainly argue that clean tech was an important innovation to get right, but the microeconomics of it were such that it was really hard to come up with something that was so decisively better. I'm not sure you even got to an ephemeral monopoly stage in any of them, and so it was, and most of innovation is actually more like clean tech. Software is one of the very few categories where the inventors, where Y was greater than 0%.
And what's your diagnosis from that? Because then that would suggest, because you would want to actually have the right incentives for investors, that would suggest that you would want to do something to create the right incentives for investors, given that they're not essentially capturing the value themselves.
Well, there's all sorts of directions you can go with this as a set of facts, but I think we often tell ourselves, like, it would be a mistake to say that software is more important than everything else, because we live in a financialized world, and so we measure the importance of things by how much money people have made in them, and we often ignore the microeconomics. If you're an Albert Einstein, you come up with general relativity. You don't get to be a billionaire. You don't even get to be a millionaire. And instead, we have these ideological claims that scientists should be like monks, and they should take a vow of poverty, and they should dedicate their lives to science. And it's the microeconomics. You can't capture any of the value. Y equals 0% throughout most of science.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No.
The interesting question there is, I completely agree with you. There have to be reward structure. You can't monopolize on dollars, which surprises me a little bit, actually, ideologically from your point of view, since when Peter and I met at a philosophy class at Stanford, Peter claimed that he would spend his life dedicated to advancing the spirit of capitalism. So this is an interesting follow-on to that.
I'm pro-capitalist.
This is an interesting follow-on to that. The second part of it is kind of a question of, like, for example, things like general relativity. It's unclear how that actually ends up in a company or a product result, and so you have to have the incentives that aren't necessarily a company or product as a result for doing that. And usually to create those incentives, you actually have to have some kind of tax and redistribution system, which you also tend to be somewhat negative on. So this is the reason I'm asking what the corollaries are.
If we had a government that spent things, I would much rather have it spend money on basic research than
would?
on wealth redistribution.
Oh,
But we live in a society in which utilitarian considerations always dominate. And so if you look at the budgets, it's the non-discretionary part that keeps growing. The discretionary part would be the part that does the kinds of things that we're talking about. But utilitarianism stops you from doing anything of the sort.
I wanted to ask you, given that you're a libertarian, and given that government has cut back so much on R&D, and you do bemoan frequently, not as much in the book, but you certainly a lot in recent years have bemoaned this idea that there's just not enough transformative technology emerging, and many would say it's partly because government cut back, but you're actually agreeing with that. So your libertarianism is not so complete that you would not want government to spend money on that.
Well, I'd want it to take money that's spending elsewhere and dedicate it to this. But that's politically impossible in our system, because whether you're on the left or the right, you will always prioritize utilitarian considerations over anything that's fundamental and oriented towards the far future.
You mean in politics?
In politics, all the polls, all the people who vote, it always prioritizes redistribution to actual investment.
So this issue of government's response we were talking about briefly before, and actually a number of the people who were up here were referring to it. So you're very pessimistic about the ability of government to kind of adapt to this modern economy that you two are such, successful partisans of. Are you pessimistic or optimistic about government and how it can?
Well, there's always a glass quarter full version where I think there's tremendous room for improvement here. So it's hard to imagine that it could become less adapted than it currently is.
Yeah.
But there is an enormous gulf between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. The way people think about things is very different. The way they think about problems is very different. We tend to think questions about science and technology are important topics. People in D.C. don't even think they're important. So it's not even like we disagree on the details. We even disagree on the weightings you'd attach to things.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is government, like especially Congress, having an intelligent technology strategy it's very hard to see your path to that. Now, I think it's super critical. I mean, think about, for example, EMRs, or think about like electronic medical records. What you could do, like a corollary to one of the things I've been thinking about is, I think would be far better for all genetic information to be available in a database for being able to do personalized information. There are negative consequences that need to be thought out, need to be protected against. What if you have a predisposition to this medical condition, or kind of how that can be used for identification. But the ability for a government to execute intelligently on what do you think your technology strategy should be, given that technology pace is accelerating. So for example, cost genetic sequencing is going down faster than Moore's law. What should you be doing, I think is extremely important, but also very difficult to make happen.
You just look at the people in it. There are 535 senators and congressmen. I looked this up the other day, and it's maybe a generous estimate, 35 of them have a background in science, engineering, technology, very broadly defined. And the rest of them, they don't understand that windmills don't work when the wind isn't blowing, or solar panels don't work at night. And so, if you're dealing with people who are basically in the Middle Ages, they'll just change the conversation to something very different.
It's pretty sad. One of the things that really came to my mind in reading Peter's book was, what does it mean for big companies? Because that's still what the economy primarily is comprised of. And you focus so much on startups. And yet at Techonomy, we think a lot about how can companies transform themselves and be more innovative and renew themselves. I was just up at Microsoft this week. They really are trying hard to renew themselves in some very impressive ways. But do you believe big companies can do that?
Absolutely. There have been definitely many cases of this. I think that the role of leadership is very important on this, and the examples where this has happened has involved cases where the founders have come back to run the company, and so I think.
But what about a P&G where the founder can't come back?
That's a problem, but But Steve Jobs coming back to Apple in 1997, that was a reasonably, they had thousands of people, they had lots of product lines. And as the founder, he had the authority to say, we're shifting completely from home computers to consumer electronics. I think Amazon is a big company. I think Google is a big company. I think these are going to be very successful founder-led companies that will continue to innovate. I think if Microsoft really wanted to change, you should get Bill Gates back to run it.
So the thing that I would emphasize and slightly modify on what Peter just said is, I think you need someone who has a founder mindset and acts with a moral authority. It doesn't actually have to be the founder, right? It's easy when it's that case and you can identify the person, but I think that there are cases where someone, and the system tends to argue against that, because the system tends to be...
Let's be clear, the system is the board of directors.
Yes.
Which consists of people who are typically political actors of one sort or another. They would like people who don't have any rough edges. They'd like people who don't say controversial things. And so you will sort of get politicians to run these companies who are not likely to be the people who meet that spec.
So well, the way I would have put the point you just made, because probably some of the way you just said it, I wouldn't say it. But the way I'd put it is, generally speaking, what happens when you have a committee is the committee values protecting against the downside more than the upside. So they would rather have the company coast for another 10 years, even if it's sacrificing its ultimate figure, because it doesn't look like there's a failure on their watch, versus taking a big risk that might fail, which has a huge negative implication, versus upside. And that's the kind of structural thing that usually founders break, and you need to have someone who will break that economic reward curve in order to succeed in innovation.
Are there any companies that are not founder-led where you think that's being executed well on?
I think Bob Iger at Disney is doing pretty well. I think it's uncommon, and it's much more common amongst founders. But I think Iger and Disney is one I would think of. I have to think about.
It's a short list.
Yes.
I have a more specific way of asking the question to Peter. Because you talk about monopoly is such a great thing, and the way to monopolize is to start with a very small constrained market and build upon that, and keep monopolizing it as you build it out. It struck me as I was reading that is super hard for an existing big company to do, because big companies want big markets. So just the mindset of being able to target a small market and dominate it and monopolize it, or whatever term you want to use, and then build out from there, almost sounds by definition impossible for big companies. Do you think big companies can do that thing? Leaving aside whether the founder's there or not, because let's talk about GE, which is represented in the room, for example, or a company like that. Could they do the kind of thing you described for monopolies themselves?
Well, this is the Clay Christensen Innovator's Dilemma type challenge, where often you'll be biased against the seemingly small opportunities at present, and you will be focused on things that are too big and that are hard to move the dial. So I do think it's a steady ongoing challenge, because it's always a question of the internal politics. I mean, you could have a small team of people work on this small new market, but then there's a question: would they get blocked by everybody else in the company, and how and would they really get the resources to push on this? And so you always end up with these internal political things. I mean, to flip this around, it's always a mystery. There's something of a mystery why you ever have startups at all. It's when we started PayPal, one of the most common questions I got was, it sounds like kind of a good product, but obviously the banks are just going to do this, and how will you ever compete with the banks? And because the banks are much bigger, they have more resources, they have more money, they can hire lots of talented people, and I think the answer why you have startups at all is because large existing institutions are too screwed up politically, and both governmental institutions and large corporations to actually execute. That's why we have startups.
Now, Reid, you look at this differently.
Let me actually also answer this question. So,
well, I want to ask you about your book too, because your book, The Alliance, was really almost written for those people, right?
Yep.
How do you
Yes.
think about managing your people so you can stay vital and stay renewed,
Yep.
and keep your people creative, et cetera?
So two things. So one is, I think it is a question of leadership. I think the question of leadership is the CEO needs to designate some set of people who can drive an innovation separate from what you can describe as political interference from the rest of the organization. And with leadership can happen. And I usually don't use Jobs as an example, but Jobs and the iPod is a good example of, I'm going to go after this MP3 player market. I'm going to do that. Everyone, like the amount of money they spent launching it was the entire amount of money spent marketing all of MP3 players before. And so it was kind of a bet on what the future looks like. The alliance, the principal question is that the only way you can have an adaptive company is if you have adaptive people. Adaptive people are no longer looking for how do I check into a 30, 40-year lifetime job. So they are looking for how is their career transformed. So you actually have to have an explicit conversation with them about essentially doing tours of duty, about how you do something really important here, that also helps your career, and maybe you'll sign up for 30 or 40 years of tours of duty, but you operate that way. And so getting adaptive people.
So is that a way of saying that you think of what companies are really is a collection of individuals who can be motivated and achieve anything depending on how they're managed? Because if that's the truth, that's a very different view than what Peter had.
In part, it's also a structural question. So for example, like the way that I gave the analysis of board of directors was not so much as these people are political, as much as the usual action of a group decision is risk minimization. Is how do you check off avoiding each risk that everyone manages? So it's also a structural question of how you operate. So the way that you operate in terms of innovation is you say, this 1, 2, or 3 people, they're driving the decisions, and they have, from the CEO, and they have protection and drive to go do. It doesn't have to involve the CEO, but it has to be able to do that. And so it's not just people and their incentives, it's also the structure of how they're connected to the rest of the company.
So in theory, I agree with that. In practice, I think we shouldn't minimize how tough it is, and we may not even disagree on that.
In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice?
In practice, there is. I seem to have heard that from someone sometime in the past. Reid was one of Reid's favorite expressions for quite some time. But I think the challenge in practice is I often think of the people who are able to drive innovation in one way or another as being quite weak at the political games. And the political processes so the more political processes you set up, it always tends to empower the wrong people. This is one of the reasons I always give advice against taking companies public. Because when you take a company public in Silicon Valley, you end up empowering a whole new class of people inside that company, in the accounting department, all sorts of places. And obviously, you need these things to work, but it really does shift the balance of power in these ways that are very hard to do anything around. And so we can come up with all kinds of processes, but then that in theory work, but that in practice I think often end up being self-defeating, where the process itself gets hijacked by people who are good at politics and bad at substance.
Who in the audience has a question or a comment for these fascinating two fellows? Does anybody have something they've been just thinking they wanted to ask? Because I have plenty more questions. Okay. Wait, that's my colleague. Nobody's.
Somebody in the back.
Somebody. Okay. Do we get the mic? Please identify yourself.
Hey, gentlemen. I'm Seth Alsbury. I'm actually with Target, somewhat of an older company. They call me the agitator there, and part of my job is to stir things up and try and figure out the innovation challenge. So to your point, Reid, I think about the committee issue, which comes up a lot. If there is a group designated with a charter to innovate for the company, how can that group, if it's say 1 to 3 people, avoid the same issue? and if it's not the one founder, as Peter pointed out, even 3 becomes an issue, right?
Well, I mean, the short answer there is having a head of strategy, a head of innovation in a small group is almost always, I've never seen it work. It's usually a disastrous failure. The question is you actually have to be, it's like we are going and building this product, we are going and doing this, and it has to be essentially funded and as an isolated group. And there's a lot of different ways of doing an isolated group. I don't know them all throughout all industries. One was how Jobs did it, which is he basically said, okay, he pulled people into a project, put them in a room where only their badges would work. He would go work with them. Part of the thing that happens at Google, and there's variation like this, when Andy Rubin was building Android, only the Android folks' badges would work in going into the Android. And basically Larry was like, look, Andy, just go. This is important to do. Make this happen. I think the common pattern is it has to be a product-oriented group. It isn't a group that says, we are producing a strategy or we are producing an innovation plan. We're building something. We're making it happen. And it's empowered by the CEO. and it is completely disconnected from any political process from the rest of the organization. And I think thus far, those are the only patterns I've seen work.
The CEO often has to have an opinion on the product, on the merits of the product.
Otherwise, they wouldn't do
So
it.
it's not a portfolio. It's not a financial portfolio of 100 different innovations without any details on any one in particular.
This is another variation of something we've said at Techonomy for years, which is that every leader really has to be a technologist in some fundamental way in the arena the world we're moving into.
Actually, here's why I would put it. Any organization that's 20 people or more has to have a technology strategy, and that's not an IT strategy. That's a strategy for how technology is changing the landscape of around your organization, within your organization, how you're playing, how you're recruiting talent, the whole thing. If you don't have a technology strategy, you're already in the process of dying.
Already in the process of dying. Wow. Okay, back here, and please identify yourself.
Desiree Dudley, MIT. I was wondering if you guys could comment on the concept of healthy ego strength versus narcissism among prime movers in innovation.
I'm not even sure. We know each other. I'm not quite sure what that means. Say another sentence.
Yeah, just like...
Well, I often work with people who are strong personalities in technology, and I find that it's a very fine thing to figure out the same characteristics that can move teams versus finding at what point is it healthy or unhealthy for the team and the technology. Do you guys have any comments on that?
It's a very fine line. I agree with that, actually.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's a little bit the distinction between madness and genius, and usually it's because you ended up being right. And so I think the high line is it's almost like a venture decision, which is in this market time, in this kind of what the market opportunity is, this person's set of skills, including being able to assemble the right network of support around them, do you back them or not? It's like a venture decision. And that's always an aspect of judgment that's a combination of what the time looks like in terms of the assets, what the time looks like in terms of the product market fit, and the set of assets that can be pulled together with some probability of getting the shot on goal. And I can't give a more specific answer because there's so many different variables into the judgment that it's hard to give a more specific answer.
Yes, it's the disturbing version of this, I think, is that we ascribe heroic leadership to people when they succeed, and then we ascribe all sorts of psychological illnesses to them when they fail. And I do think there is always this crazy dynamic with a lot of the founders in Silicon Valley where when things go wrong, it is like a primitive tribe where everyone's running after them and going to chop their heads off or something like that. So you do have these sort of there's a social dynamic where it's a very fine line from hero worship to scapegoating.
Before I let you guys go, one of the things I want to hear you both talk about is this issue of the future of jobs and the middle class in an increasingly automated age. Because I think you, Peter, have sort of dismissed that as a concern in some, I don't know if it was in your book so much as
yes.
in the thing you did with Andreessen, you were saying some very negative things about that, and maybe elsewhere too, but it doesn't sound like you're very worried about that.
Well, I think the history of technology broadly for the last 200 years has been a history in which certain jobs have been lost, but it's been replaced by other jobs, and people have been wrong to exaggerate this. The Luddites tried to destroy the factory equipment in the mid-19th century because weavers were going out of losing their jobs to the textile factories, but in fact, technology had the effect of freeing people up to do other things. And I think it's premature to say that there's something radically different about computer technology. If we had strong AI, if you had robots that looked like people and that were smarter than us, and that you didn't have to pay anything, I think that would be a scary prospect for middle-class jobs, and even I would be worried about that.
But you make it clear in the book, you don't expect that anytime soon.
No time soon, and I think the first question we'd ask at that point is not economic, it's political. It's are they friendly or not? It would be like extraterrestrials landing on this planet.
Robocalypse.
If you had aliens landing on this planet, you wouldn't ask the economic question, you'd ask the political question. Now, I think it is true that we've had a lot of pressure on middle-class wages in the US and Western Europe over the last 40 years. And I think that coincides much more closely with this era of globalization than with technology, which has been going on for hundreds of years. And so I would say that people blame too much on technology, and that the real problem is with competition with low-wage workers in India, China, places like that. I'm not against globalization, But I think that's the real pressure point on middle class wages in our world, and we shouldn't scapegoat technology for it.
What about you?
So I actually think globalization is in part a result of technology. So I think technology does have the impact on globalization, although I agree with you, that's the larger impact than the automation of factories and so forth, which has impact. The other thing I agree with you on is, look, in the general reaction that people have to this is let's slow down technology, let's limit it, let's do that sort of thing. That's actually, generally speaking, a failing game when other people aren't going to be slowing down technology, because we're not solipsists, right? We don't exist in the world itself. Other people are also organizing around it. However, these intermediate zones where there's this transition from one industry to another are hugely disruptive. People suffer a lot. There is, whether or not you do have an uncertainty about how much of the middle class will come back or how many middle class jobs will be. We can have faith that it's look, we've gone through this pattern before, it'll work out, it'll be fine. But I think that in that problem, both to minimize the depth and length of the suffering in the transition and also to maximize, I think we want a middle-class society, I do think it's an important call for how can we employ technology, rhetorically Moore's law, to help with the transition of the middle class to new jobs, whether it's education and training, whether it's new kinds of jobs. And I think it's worth putting some energy to that, because I do think that there is, like you say, well, we got through the textile mills, but there were tremendous social unrest during that was part of the reason why we have an English term Luddite, was because there was in fact actually a lot of turmoil going on. And the question is, well, how do we navigate that better?
I'm going to get in trouble if we don't wrap this, but it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for coming. Thank you for doing everything you both do. Thanks so much. Thank you, Peter. So,